Kia ora and welcome to the programme. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative based here in New Zealand. My name's Ian Kaplan and I welcome you to our Conversations webinars. And this is episode 3 in our monthly conversation programme. Today, a conversation about crisis. More on precisely what we mean by that in just a moment, but I open today, as we always do here at GREG, because the GREG Secretariat is hosted by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, MB. I open with MB's karakia. I do so now. Tawhia tō mana kia mau, kia maia, kahuri, takuaro, ki te pai kahurangi, kei reira te oranga roku. Ma mahi tahi ka ora ka puawai. Amato mahi katoa ka pono katika. Tihe moriora. Well, it's very nice to see you all members of the audience, and as we're assembling and coming together, and I can see that the numbers are going up on the screen, I remind us, for those of us who've already been, and for those of us who haven't, to these webinars, that these conversation webinars are really the places where you can connect with, have conversations with members of the regulatory profession. Why do we have them? They're conversations that GREG put on for you, they bring to you to assist, I guess, to inspire and indeed, if I may say so, provoke conversations that you either, as a case may be having or may wish to have. You could be, as the invitation reminds us, with the privacy notices, etc., watching us live. We are recording as well, and in both the live and the recorded context, these webinars are very much in the public domain. So it's always appropriate for me to say at the start of each webinar, wherever and indeed whenever you're watching us, you're very welcome here. Today's is a conversation about crisis, a conversation about crisis regulation. There are all sorts of formulations that we could use to describe what the conversation is about. I had in mind a conversation about the crisis, a conversation about COVID, or more strictly, but more long-windedly, a conversation about crisis, shock, and ongoing disruption, including without limitation, COVID. That's all a bit long-winded, so a conversation about crisis it is. But it's really important to look at what we haven't called the programme in order to perhaps determine what the programme today is about. What is its scope? How did regulators, we're going to talk about in this conversation, respond to COVID? How did the crisis of COVID bring policymakers and regulators together? How did the crisis that was COVID, but it could be any other crisis in the future we confront or being prepared to confront, what do we learn from it? What do we do? What did we not do? How did stuff that we were doing already get accelerated? How did new stuff get put on and created and then in turn accelerated? And what does all this tell us about regulatory practice, regulatory stewardship, regulatory systems, and what are the takeaways for regulators in the long term? Lots to talk about in the conversation, members of the audience. You're very much included in it. And I'm going to give you just a couple of tips if you're more Teams than Zoom, for example. The way that you can do that is in the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll see that there's a Q&A. Please do at any point pop a question or indeed a comment in the Q&A, and at the appropriate juncture, we'll pick that up and we'll deal with it. You can also vote on the question, so you get a little bit of sort of movement there. Not only can you vote, you can also emote, if I can put it that way. You've got the reactions with the little face with the cross in the top right-hand corner embedded in the face. I'm surprised that there's not more of a pained reaction in that particular emoji, but you can select from any number of those. You can also use the chat function. The chat function is very much where you can sort of communicate with each other multilaterally. It's not rude, it's not, the idea is that these are networking sessions as well. And also we see a lot of really good material that we can talk about. Thank you for the thumbs up. It's always encouraging this time of the morning. We see a lot of good material that we can elicit from the chat process. So with that all in mind, let's come and meet our guests. Joining us in the virtual studio today are practitioners from across local and central government. They'll be well known, I know, to a number of you. If you joined us last month, we re-welcome back George Mason. He has actually left the virtual studio since he was with us last month. He's a Director of Regulatory Environment at MB, but he's got truckloads of experience across all sorts of sectors: workplace health and safety, employment, regulatory systems. And it really brings a wealth of knowledge and practical expertise on this and many other topics. So welcome George. George is joined by Karel Boakes, who's a regulatory manager at Manawatu District Council. Karel has left the studio since she was asked with us back in 2020, when we were actually talking about aspects of how her agency was dealing with COVID and what was the particular stretch that Karel and Manawatu had to undergo, as it were, to deal with the certain kind of fresh regulatory issues. Did it cause regulatory muscle strain or regulatory resilience? Find out more in just a moment, members of the audience. And last but not least, always necessarily close to COVID, as a border regulator in customs, we're very pleased, lucky to have Richrd Bargh join us. Richrd is the Deputy Chief Executive, Policy, Legal and Strategy at Customs. So with that kind of triple-handed title, you can already see what Richrd has to look after in terms of the stewardship aspect of life. Welcome, colleagues. It's lovely to have you. Thank you very much for joining us. Members of the audience, don't be shy. I know you're not diving on the Q&A and comments, but I'm going to ask George, first of all, what's this webinar all about? I mean, crisis is our title. It's our code for COVID, as well as shock and response. George isn't shy. Is it the right word to start and frame this conversation?
Thanks for the introduction, Ian. Well, I mean, I'm not so sure. I know that you like a touch of drama in these shows, but I guess, you know, we sort of frame it as crisis, but maybe we take some of the hint from our title, you know, regular. We're really about, you know, not being in crisis mode ourselves, even if others are having to deal with crisis. The point about regulatory systems and regulators is there to make things regular, make things smooth, continue operation in a way that is normalized as much as possible. So I guess my initial response to your provocative title is, well, there may be crisis raging around us, but we can't really allow crisis to infiltrate our own kind of actions in our own operations, because actually the expectation is that we won't run around like chickens with our heads cut off. We'll actually be able to respond to the circumstances as they're unfolding in measured and thoughtful ways, and in ways that continue the operation of our society and the systems that we're responsible for. So I think of it probably as how do our systems deal with shock, because these things come along from time to time, and how do we then deal with the resulting disruption and uncertainty that arises from that shock. And now that can be for briefer periods of time, but as COVID's illustrated, we've had to deal with disruption and uncertainty in our operating environment now for in excess of 2 years, and elements of it show no signs of abating anytime soon. And in fact, in that time, we've had other things happen which are causing other bits of our regulatory system to respond. We've got a fairly serious geopolitical hot conflict in Europe. We're trying to think about how we deal with climate adaptation. The march of technological change hasn't stopped. These are all things that are informing our operating environment that mean that we are dealing with uncertainty in how we go about our regulatory tasks. So an opening salvo from me, we just have to keep calm and carry on, because that's what we're here to do as regulators.
Keep calm and carry on is perhaps on a more cheerful note, the way to pause that point. I mean, I think crisis equals shock and disruption. What do you think, members of the audience? And in terms of the long-term forward planning, that's going to be a theme we touch on. Also, thank you for that, George, is opportunity. Crisis can create opportunity. How much of this is played for regulatory systems? As I think George implies, what has worked, what hasn't worked, we're not out of the woods yet. What kind of new characteristics, so new ways of dealing to keep calm and to carry on, have been brought into play? And I want to just talk about perhaps the opportunities that have arisen by accident, by design, bit of both, for new style public service leadership. And Richrd, with all the titles that you've got in your job title, you've seen all sorts of aspects. You're a border regulator, you've got the border exec board. What opportunities have there been for you institutionally at Customs, particularly as a border regulator, to do that sort of collaborative leadership in a cross-government context?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So the border sector has always operated at a high degree of collaboration We've historically delivered some really good and improved services jointly for operation at the border. We've generally worked really well with the private sector, airports, airlines, shipping companies, and we have a lot of integrated systems, for example. But COVID really required us to operate at a vastly different level, a much, much more significant level. The crisis was impacting on various different ways on the way the border was operating. There were frequent changes, frequent closures, frequent changes in policy. Different controls needed to be put in place at airports and seaports. Major implications for the workforce, who had to go through testing and vaccination requirements, and a degree of cooperation and integration with other agencies that the border sector traditionally hadn't always worked that well with, I have to say. So the opportunity was there to create a quite different model. The public sector legislation had recently been changed to allow for a thing called an interdepartmental executive board. And we created the first one, the Border Executive Board. And essentially what that meant was that the chief executives of the relevant agencies had a collective responsibility for stewardship of the border, particularly at this point in crisis. So they had to collectively work as a board would, as you would expect, to solve problems, to set plans together, to respond to the different circumstances that were arising. The board was set up under the chief executive of Customs. It could have been the chief executive of any one of the other agencies. It's set up within a servicing agency, which is Customs, but it has its own appropriation. So it almost operates as a small public service entity in its own right. It meets weekly to cover the issues of the day and frequently dealing with significant issues, from border closures through to, what are the requirements for the workforce. I think importantly, Ian, it made us rethink what cooperation at the border meant. Traditionally, customs, immigration, primary industries, we've worked biosecurity, we've worked really well together. We've formed the border sector. We need to involve the Ministry of Health from day one. They actually have much more impact on the border than any other agency during this time of crisis. The link with the transport sector was massive impact on the transport sector and how it operated at the border. So we brought Ministry of Transport in, and we've worked very closely with agencies like Maritime New Zealand, for example. Foreign Affairs and Trade are actually part of the border sector as well. And equally, the creation of the BEB meant that as the policy making was done at the centre, led by DPMC for the COVID response, we had a ready-made structure to respond to that and could provide input, not just from us, but from the various contacts we have in the private sector around the practicality of some of those controls. I know other sectors have started to set up interdepartmental executive boards as well. I think there's a couple of others. There's some really good guidelines on the Public Service Commission's website about what they are for and how they could operate. And obviously, if anyone's really interested in how it's working, I'd be happy to answer any questions or provide feedback on that.
Thank you, Richrd, and I'm sure the audience will take you up on that offer. That's a really good framing of, I guess, the structure which was in play. Also the sense that there are connections which may not have been necessarily obviously border-ridden until the emergency hit us. We'll come back to that point. I want to move towards how local authority response was characterised. And Karel, to you, just a couple of examples when this all began in 2020. You were talking about Malware initiatives in relation to everyday things like deferral of debt payments for dog registration, food control plan fees, in and after lockdown. I think some of that was COVID relevant in terms of the enforcement mitigation approach. Some of it was more non-COVID and generic, perhaps more archaic rules about, I think, dog registration you were talking about, where there was an RMA governed issue, and pun intended, but that bit rural owners. To what extent was there a legal stretch of the envelope, and to what extent has it paid off? And I guess to what extent perhaps hasn't it?
Okay, thanks, Ian. Thanks for having me back as well. It's nice
Welcome.
to be back.
Good to see you.
So in terms of when COVID first came about 2 years ago, and we started looking at ways to assist the customer, being more pragmatic given the environment had changed, the fees waivers went down very well, obviously. There was a lot of impact financially on people at the time, and they really took that on well and appreciated what we were doing. In terms of getting the payments back, we did. It was just a case of stretching out the period before the penalties were applied. So that's worked really well. I think it's important to think about what George was saying earlier as well, about not focusing on crisis so much as being adaptable. I think our environments, particularly in local government, is very used to change. I mean, we have a lot of change all the time. If there's one constant, it's change. So this is just another form of change for us that we're having to implement. In terms of that adaptability ongoing over the last 2 years, and something that is still happening for us now today, it's about the impact it's having on statutory timeframes that are written into the legislation for us in a lot of spaces. So given this environment we're in now, where we've got issues with resourcing, higher turnover than expected, issues with recruitment, trying to get competent people on board to do the work, and obviously high turnover, high workloads at the same time. It's kind of a perfect storm, which we can't now meet our statutory timeframes for. So with that, that's more of an acceptance that is the case, and not trying to push and speed things up at the risk of quality going down. So in our space at the moment, we're increasing our comms out to our customers, making them aware of the situation we're in. And it's usually well received because the industry is also having the same impacts themselves in that space. So that they're pretty understanding about it. The other issue around, that's particularly the case in building and planning, by the way. Building and planning environment is really struggling at the moment. The alcohol licensing space, that's another area where timeframes are upon us, and it's being challenged by our reliance on other authorities. So we need information from the MOH, for example, and they're being impacted because their priorities are COVID at the moment. So has a knock-on effect for us and the customer. So again, timeframes are stretched out. The comms to the customer is always, this is a situation, it is a reality. Get your applications in early. We'll do the best we can in these situations to meet your timeframes. So it's just that communication and understanding and expectation to be set out there. And obviously, you've all heard of the GIB crisis that's going on at the moment. Absolutely. So another big area, again, in the building space, there's quite a lot of difficulties it's facing at the moment, both for us and on the industry side as well. BCAs, or building consent authorities, are having to look at how to adapt their processes for acceptance of substitutions of materials. So GIB's obviously the main one, but there are also issues around supplies of other building materials as well. So when we're seeing a lot more amendments coming through for substitutions, we're having to rethink how we apply a risk-based approach to approvals of those types of materials. And often that can be difficult because they haven't got the same level of documentation to demonstrate compliance with the code and all those sorts of things. But obviously councils and BCAs are trying to look at ways of having a risk-based approach to that, to try and enable continuity in the industry and keep the process moving.
And I think one thing that leaps out there, Karel, just jumping in if I may, is you're talking about GIB, you're talking about building materials and quality of building materials. That's also quality of regulation. You're pointing to the haircut potentially that time limits could impose to quality. But what you're saying is there's a trade-off, and it's quality. To what extent, and this is a general question for the panel, to what extent is the trade-off very live of quality as against what this particular crisis has done to the regular time limits. I don't know if anyone wants to pick that up, Karel, again, or perhaps to anyone else.
Well, like I said, we try and focus on the quality first. Obviously, we're very mindful of those timeframes and making sure people aren't inconvenienced too much. And obviously, there's all sorts of things like funding and economics that come into play with that. But at the end of the day, like I say, we take that risk-based approach, for instance, with plasterboard, making those decisions, just one example. If it's a basic plasterboard that has no particular function other than just being on the wall, so it's not part of a fire system, it's not part of a noise system or anything like that, then in those situations you could be more accepting of a substitution in that space. So yeah, it's having the ability to analyze it and make a judgment and having discretion.
Yeah. And high level, this is about the ability to enable innovation and adaptation, I guess, at the front line in the room where it's happening. We've got a couple of questions coming through. Thank you for those. Please keep popping them through. I guess, George, I'm going to come to you on this. This is a bit of a twin question. First of all, how do you think all of this has recharacterised the way we look at the modern regulator, if it's changed it at all? And also the question here, do you see similar structures being proposed or in play from the lessons learned for looking at other kind of imperatives and crises in waiting, like climate change?
Yeah, look, thanks, Ian. I think you perhaps made a valid point, maybe deliberately, provocatively. You talked about stretching the legal envelope, I think was the phrase that that sort of tripped off the tongue. And I think that's a really big consideration in this space, actually, because we're all creatures of statute. We're all here to implement legislative regimes that regularise activity either between citizens and the state or as between particular citizens. And so our mandate is set out in law. And so that question about, well, how does our legal mandate, how does our legal envelope fit the circumstances that we're now facing, and what's our ability to stretch that envelope? I would be hesitant to suggest that we depart from the envelope because I think that's a problem for the legitimacy of regulators if they feel that they can take a wholesale approach to the crises, which is, we throw out the rule book. That seems to me that would be putting the baby out with the bathwater. So we're in this space of what's your ability to stretch the envelope, to stretch how you do things while maintaining your legitimacy as a regulator. And we've seen a bunch of responses to that. I mean, some regimes, performance-based regimes, have a greater inherent ability to stretch. Some have ability to offer dispensations around things like timeframes. Some have actually needed to be kind of retrofitted rather urgently through urgent legislation to make sure that the legal regime that underpins it is able to bend and fit the circumstances that regulators are facing in order to maintain legitimacy in the regulatory system. So we're sort of seeing a combination of things playing out here in terms of how our regulatory systems are able to navigate this disruption and uncertainty. But I think that it really comes back to that point that you made about what's the ability to stretch the legal envelope, and that's going to change depending upon your audience. I mean, my personal experience with the COVID crisis was as the General Manager of Employment Services at the time, and responsible for employment standards. Now, we're regulating the relationship between employers and employees. COVID came along and threw a whole bunch of employment relationships straight up in the air. There was issues about whether employers could conform to legal requirements, not necessarily vis-a-vis the government or officials, but vis-a-vis each other. Part of a regime too that also recognises that parties can agree things between themselves. So, there's often a legislated process or a legal process for how those agreements get made, but actually there's quite a bit of flexibility for the parties to respond to the crisis within a sort of sense of a set of process requirements. So I guess this is just not a one size fits all. I think something that is really important, though, is the capability of your systems and the capability of the people that are in your systems. What's the level of knowledge and expertise? What's the system strength? What's the quality of your stakeholder relationships? Because it's really at the time when you're stretched and you have to flex quickly that you're going to find out how good you really are on all
and
of
how
those
good the elastic
functions.
is.
Yeah, that's right. It's sort of like, well, we're going to get given a test. Do we stand or do we break? And, interestingly, where do we find we have strengths, and where do we maybe discover that we've got weaknesses? These crises, as you frame them, are great revealers for us. And there's an awful lot to be learned if we take the time to reflect on how we've been able to deal with the circumstance.
Thank you, George. We'll come back to that lesson. So, Richard, I want to go to you because it must give you a headache, if I may say. So, you've got legal and policy in your job title. You've got bits of elastic, metaphorically, that are being stretched left, right, and centre. George has raised a point, of course, about actually the general public who we regulate, or those in the system who we regulate, also have an elasticity of their own, which they can work with. What's been the trade-off? I mean, you've got potential higher devolution to front line. You've got accelerated innovation of things in play already. You've got creation and total innovation of new things. You've got a board that's got a cluster of agencies who touch and concern it. What's the price of the trade-off, and what are the kind of navigational tips that you'd commend to people?
So I think, Ian, I think of two periods of really major uncertainty and how we responded to some of the problems that those periods created. The first lockdown is the first one. The impact that was having on businesses who import and people who pay customs and the supply chain was very, very uncertain. No one knew really what was going to go on with that. And we had to make some rapid and quite quick decisions about exactly stretching the elastic and how far we stretched the envelope at that time. And the other challenge was what was going on with our workforce. With airports closing, pretty much closed for a period of a year, we wanted to maintain capability in that space. What do we do with all these people, and is there opportunities there? So I think we were partly successful. And I just think George has hit the nail over that time in terms of how we responded. We made some quick and dirty decisions because we had to. I think, for example, we allowed parts of the import sector to do things that we just normally would never do. We say it's completely wrong, but it's within the boundaries of our legislation to allow it, so we will allow it. And we got some of those things right because I think, we had a good experience capability in our operational areas, closely tied to other agencies and closely tied to the private sector that we're talking about, who could make good decisions on the ground and balance risk against, we can actually manage this.
And is that, just interrupting Richard, because if I might say so, it's really interesting. Is that because you had the pre-existing relationships with the private sector players? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think I was actually working in our operations at that time during that first lockdown. Yeah. And that first week, I was on the phone constantly to people I already knew, gauging the impact of what is happening in your sector and allowing us to respond rapidly and quickly and make good decisions about things that just made sure cargo kept flowing and that could preserve some degree of revenue, because that actually was the biggest challenge. And I think the one issue I think that we still need to work our way through is, we provided so much support to businesses to survive over the last 2 years. At some point, some of those businesses we probably haven't gauged that well, about their ability to survive when under pressure. Something's going to come back and haunt us in that space, I feel, in the next little while, in terms of their debt that they've built up and the structures they've got in terms of managing cash flow weren't that great to begin with. So we've kind of propped that up, and when George was talking about the kind of things that might come back and bite us in the bum later, that's one of the things I think that we'll see.
Zombie companies, things like that.
Yes. Sorry, Ian, I just wanted to highlight one other period of real uncertainty, and that's when we opened up to Australia for travel last year, and then the Delta virus started to show up in Australia. I think that period of time remains one of the most difficult ones I think I've had as a public servant, because the government was under huge political pressure to do stuff for New Zealanders in Australia, to put in place controls, because people in New Zealand were saying, we don't want that virus here. We hadn't yet got the vaccination rates up. The border was the nexus for much of that debate and discussion. I'm not sure we managed that circumstance that well. I think the points of view of the industry and the experienced regulatory agencies who operate at the border was sometimes had to be subsumed to what was going to really work from the government's point of view and the media and from a political point of view. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. We didn't get everything right over that time, got most things right. We probably could have done better. And the most important thing, I think, is how do you capture that input from the sector that knows its stuff, knows what it's dealing with, and can see the risk, and get that into the minds of the decision makers when they're working in a crisis.
And I think that's the value of it. And this is a fascinating insight. Thank you, Richrd, George, and Karel. Members of the audience, I can see that you're listening, watching, and your questions are piping through. I will just to turn to some of the questions. But one of the things that Richrd has pointed to is a relationship with the private sector, politicians as well. They don't just go quiet when this sort of thing goes on. I mean, if you look, for example, at alcohol licensing in the local context, Karel, to you probably see the question there, and the litigious nature of applicants, potentially supermarkets, exacerbated either in or just outside of a COVID or other crisis situation. How do you manage that kind of relationship when potentially things can get a bit hot, as it were, and the crisis is exacerbating it? People will still want to litigate. Zombie companies may still want to trade on when perhaps there's a view that says that the insolvency system is a more correct place for them. And we could be seen as the public sector to be assisting them with keeping them going. How do you manage all of that?
In terms of, I'll answer the question on the alcohol licensing litigious nature. That was pre-COVID anyway. That's always been an issue, and it's what's meant that a lot of territorial authorities haven't been able to put LAPs, local alcohol policies, in place, just because of the strength of those large commercial businesses and the legal power that they have. So that has caused a problem for local authorities to be able to administer the legislation and try and prevent harm under the Act, which is what the purpose is all about. I think this is a national problem. It's always been there. I don't feel like it's got worse because of COVID, but in terms of trying to fix that, basically it comes down to relationships, and you were talking about it before, is having an understanding of your customer and having an awareness of what's going on. And I think that's where local authorities are very good. I mean, they're local authorities. They understand the local nature of things. So we have very good relationships with our customers across all the different regulatory areas. And it comes down to those people on the front line doing that work, having those conversations where they can influence and try and negotiate some kind of compliance in that space where you don't have the tools of a local alcohol policy because it didn't get through or whatever else. So and obviously you've got collaboration with MOH and the police as well. So you all kind of work together to try and talk to these customers and get some sort of voluntary compliance in that space. That's generally how it's been working. Obviously, there are hearings for certain other things that we don't quite get the voluntary compliance for, and we have to go down that road, and that takes time and resource and all the rest of it. But the first and foremost, is really to build those relationships, try and get voluntary compliance in the first instance.
And what about relationships with central government? Is it in a way easier to get on with a customer than it is with central government?
From a local government perspective?
Yeah.
I think it's improving, definitely. In the time that I've worked in regulatory for about 17 and a half years, when I first arrived, there was a distinct separation between central and local government in my space. But I think that's definitely improving, and the amount of consultation that we now get involved with, and the relationships and contacts that we have, there's a lot more spaces to have that communication, like webinars and things like that. So I think the understanding between central and local government is definitely improving, which is a good thing.
It is a good thing, and it's definitely a theme that we'll see in this series of conversational webinars, but more on that another time, members of the audience. One other thing, and I'll make no apology for making a plug here, of course, our GREG YouTube channel, just YouTube search Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, you will see a raft of films, webinars, and all sorts of things, including a 3-part series of NEMA regulating before, during, and after a crisis. And one of the key points of that trilogy of very short films is really what we've been talking about. The idea of setting up and having a pre-existing relationship on the shelf and keeping it alive in a meaningful sense, so that we're not, as public servants, traumatized into immediately creating fresh relationships with potentially the pain and the difficulty that involves. If you've just joined us, you're over halfway through a conversation about crisis, which is really shorthand for a conversation about COVID and, as George has, I think, expressed and implied, shock and disruption that carries on, that can be associated with any crisis that a regulator has to deal with. Question that's come through here is, are there any general frameworks, principles, I think implicitly hints and tips, that you use to guide through change or an unfolding crisis? And this is really, when you're looking after the well-being, the organisation, change management, organisation strategy, system objectives, very much more at home, but also away as well, in terms of your local agency, but the macro responsibilities that are had there. I don't know, George, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question, but I've been a little bit sneaky, and I've looked at another question which follows it.
Have you now? Go on then.
Which talks about the relationship between crisis and intelligent and risk-based regulation. I think there's a bit of an interplay between these two questions. I think if we think about crises, what you're really talking is issues management, actually, on a grand scale. So if you think about your sort of risk issue kind of distinction as we normally think about it, a risk is what might happen in the future, and an issue is when it's actually happened and now you're having to deal with it. So by definition, yes, there's an intrinsic link. I think is it Jason who's asked this question. There is an absolute link between crisis, intelligent, risk-based regulation, in the sense that a crisis is an issue that's arisen on a grand scale, and now you're having to deal with an issue as opposed to just dealing with forward-looking risk. So yes, in a way, it is kind of looking out the back of the boat. I guess the challenge, though, is to understand and accept that you're never going to be able to head off every issue. You're going to have to deal with them. We're not at the game where we can, through our regulatory systems, which includes things actually like regulating to prevent health pandemic, that in itself is a regulatory task, where we're going to head everything off. So this probably takes you back into Aaron's question about, well, how do you guide yourself through these essentially issues management incidents? I guess the first point is and I'm going to put a shameless plug here for some work I'm doing, Ian, and I'm happy to share with those participants on the video, because in my current role, I'm actually carrying out a review of how have we managed to navigate our way through the disruption and uncertainty that COVID's brought about. And it's started with an initial literature review, which has revealed some interesting things which go to some of the themes we've talked about here. that we know that the crisis here accelerated the adoption of various tools that were probably already in train, but it quickened their uptake. We know that it pointed to the adaptability and flexibility of regulatory systems as being really important. So, designing for adaptability and flexibility becomes important. We know that public leadership actually was really, really important in dealing with the crisis. So, lifting the integrity and the quality of public institutions and public trust in institutions is really significant. We know from our literature review that New Zealand fared pretty well on that front. Actually, there's a high levels of public trust, and that enables you to exercise that kind of goodwill to navigate your way through crises in a coordinated way. And we know that preparedness is really important as well. So those, I guess, are just some general principles that maybe talk back into Erin's question about frameworks to guide through change or unfolding crises. Well, you don't really want to get behind or be on the back of all that stuff, but there are some things that you can definitely do to get yourself prepared. And in a way, this conversation around regulatory stewardship, which is trying to build a broader base and a broader conceptual notion about what regulation is and how we approach regulation, is all part of that kind of preparedness and building our capability to deal with uncertainty, building our expertise. And in terms of the narrow point of the question, yes, a whole bunch of organisations stood up their emergency management committees. They redirected functions. I know in my case, for example, the Labour Inspectorate stopped doing labour inspection work. It wasn't possible under the COVID requirement, but we basically redeployed into the social welfare system that was responsible for paying out the wage subsidies. It was connected with our area of work. We could make a contribution in that space, and the Labour Inspectorate certainly did through that period. I could talk about other functions, but that was a really obvious one. So there's a principle there that comes through about how do you operate with others, this idea that clusters emerged actually, and as a way of dealing with issues. Richard's case is one in point where you cluster up with people in your space. Another point that's emerged from the literature actually is this really important relationship between central government, local government and community, and being able to operate that really effectively, and central government not trying to hold on to stuff too tightly, but actually being able to let local government do the things that it can do within the communities that it knows best. So these are, I guess, the principles or notions that are being revealed as being more helpful when we're thinking about how we deal with these kinds of circumstances.
Thank you, George. Yeah, no, I was going to say their most appropriate service provider also is the kind of the motif, I think, without wanting to cut in on what you were saying as well, is delegate for local authority, delegate to the front line. Some are central questions, some are local questions. Admit that government can't do everything. It was very much part of a case of one of the first webinars 2 years ago that GREG produced in a completely different context, that working with an NGO outside government by definition was actually the way forward to deal with certain aspects of difficult debt for people. And it's actually that honesty and humility, which I'm detecting from all of you on the panel, colleagues. Keep them flying in terms of questions, members of the audience. I know you're watching the carefully. One thing that occurs to me is the S word, stewardship, which George points to. Richard, I'll flip this to you because it's just a bit of a story arc of this particular conversation series that, without overselling it, regulatory stewardship in a relatable way does seem to be a way to mitigate problems. Now, some people would find in old-fashioned language actually most alarming, but some people would actually say that's most alluring, and it's a good thing. Do you think it's a good thing, Richard? And can you relate it to a wider audience, and why should we bother, particularly in the COVID context?
And I definitely think it is a good thing. I think I think it's incredibly important that we see ourselves as stewards of a system and stewards of a system which impacts on New Zealanders. We don't just see ourselves as an operational agency or operators who do things at the border. You've been running, I think, a couple of forums for customs recently, where we've been challenging some of our revenue function in particular about how they see themselves as stewards. And certainly, I would go, of all the functions in customs, that one in particular, is the one where the operational areas, the people who do things such as audit and even the direct debit, see themselves as part of a wider system and take care and attention and see the linkages and the need to do other things. I think in the COVID space, it's incredibly challenging. It has been incredibly challenging for all to understand the overall impacts of this crisis on the system, on the overall system, and to just see their role in it and part of it. I think some of the structures we've tried to set up have been aimed at mitigating that. So BEB is the obvious one if I think about it. That part of BEB's role was to bring forward some of the operational impacts through to government of the really rapid decisions they needed to make to put in place controls at the border to prevent the virus from coming into the country. Those decisions needed to be made at phenomenal pace. Thought about on a Friday, become law on Monday, and that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
If you think about how quickly we stood up a quarantine service, or a maritime border response, or how the responses to the need to put in place testing requirements or vaccination requirements for the workforce, just phenomenal pace. So I think the theme for me is system readiness.
Yeah.
So how do you bring forward the expertise from within an agency, talk about system readiness, get people who are going to be doing these jobs in the front line, how do you get them ready for this circumstance as it emerges and as it plays out? How do you brief them? How do you communicate the expectations? I'm in awe, actually, of the way the workforce at the border has responded over the last 2 years. They've just been, they've responded to changes phenomenally well. And I think that the readiness question, the readiness and preparedness of people to go, look, we're ready to respond. It's part of our mantra as an organisation. We see ourselves as stewards of the border as a system, therefore we will do this for you, has been the thing. And that's a part of a culture of organisational development for the border sector for a long period of time. It's just not something you could grow overnight. Equally, though, sorry to keep going on.
No,
equally though, it hasn't stopped people from questioning the validity of some of the things that we've put in place as well. And having the ability to capture that has been really important.
I mean, what would you say? Thank you for that, Rich. What would you say, if I can put it this crudely, somebody in the room where it happened on the border doing fantastic work, but they're saying regulatory stewardship, this interconnectedness of all things, that's just some guff that's come out of Wellington. What's the counterpoint to that, George?
Well, I think what's implicit in regulatory stewardship is we're reframing what it is to be regulators. We're reframing away from I perform a defined function and I'm going to argue a demarcation point if you try to get me to do anything else than this particular bit of widget, to actually we have to see ourselves as caretakers, as part of something bigger than us, that we understand the overarching objectives of what we're trying to achieve, and that with that we're able to reframe our contribution into that space as one that assists the overall objective, whatever form it might need to take from time to time. This comes back to, I think what we're really trying to do here is build resilience more generally, build capability in our regulatory systems. I think what the crisis piece does is it's a bit more acute, and it's given us a bit of a test. It's probably revealed where we've got some shortcomings in the way we think of our regulatory stewardship. It's probably revealed some strengths that we didn't know we had, that we need to keep an eye on and make sure we keep and we foster. But I'm a big fan of Nassim Taleb's book Anti-Fragility, where he talks about the merit of things that not only are resilient, but they actually gain from disorder. They're able to learn and adapt, and as part of that process, a bit like our immune system or building muscle at the gym, where through this piece of exercise, we can emerge as stronger and better regulators and better configured to deal with the next disruption, which we know is going to be coming. It's probably already upon us, but it speaks into that broader question you have around, well, that's what stewardship entails. It entails us being able to think more broadly than the immediate task. It involves us being able to build capability beyond our skill sets, and it means kind of reframing a little bit about how we think of ourselves as regulators and what our contribution is.
Yes, thank you, George. And it makes me think as well, I'm going to do a quick, I suppose it's a half a plug here, is the work that Richrd mentioned. How do agencies feel about, or might they feel about that sort of stewardship work and some, I put it this way, some input from GREG in terms of workshopping. Just answers on a postcard if that touches you and that's something that you're concerned with watching. We have a broad church watching. Karel, I'll come to you. What worries you most about all this down the line? You know, we're not out of the woods yet, but we're a few years in, just in terms of being a regulator in a local authority. What's the worry about perhaps the lessons learned that we've talked about, or the lessons not being learned, or anything else?
I don't like to use the word worry. In terms of lessons learned for us, we obviously as a local authority deal with civil defence as well all the time. So as well as the COVID 2 years that we've had, I know our area in particular has had a number of flood events and things like that thrown in on top. So we're quite used to dealing and responding to, crises and difficult situations. It's kind of in our DNA. We are quite prepared in that space. We do have business continuity plans for all sorts of things, and they're reviewed quite regularly in that space. And we are very adaptive. And I think what's come out of this whole experience for us is the innovation part. It is the learning new ways of doing things. It is the, being resilient. So, like, for example, in our situation, quite timely, we introduced a resource consent online system right when the first lockdown happened. It didn't, it wasn't planned that way, but it was very convenient that happened. And since then, we've just been looking at better efficiencies in-house to help us with our staff and also the customer, and also in our inspection spaces as well, virtual inspections, those sorts of things, looking at that. Helping the customer to help themselves. So half of our inspections fail in the building space. That's a lot of resource to re-inspect. So what we did was put all the checklists that we use, it's not a secret, put it out there. Please use these. Use these to prepare better so you can pass first time. It'll be cheaper for you, it'll be more efficient, and we can get our timeframes down. So it's things like that, trying to come up with solutions like that. But the one, I guess, worry, if I'm going to say that word, has been the focused concentration on people's health and well-being through this space. Given that perfect storm I was talking about before, the well-being of our staff has been paramount. We've had a lot of people away sick, a lot of pressures because of the additional workloads put on them. So we've been very cognizant of making sure we're looking after them. If you can look after them, then obviously they'll look after the customer in turn. So, that's just the golden rule, I guess, for any business. But yeah, that's the one thing I think there's been an increased focus on, not just for our staff, but obviously the customers, and understanding that they're also going through similar, stresses through this process.
Thank you, Karel. And very much part of the series when we first met on the screen, of course, was the modern regulator, which axiomatically, really fundamentally has well-being, not just in this scenario, but more generally. George, worries from you, if I can use that, and also, I guess, a comment on well-being, because that was going to be my next question too.
Look, I think the well-being worry is a good one. I worry probably about something a bit different. Something else to worry about, I guess. I think there can be a tendency in crises and stress to make a bunch of dispensations and concessions in relation to regulatory regimes. Regulatory regimes are put in place because we accept that there's risk inherent with the activity and that there are vulnerabilities which come to play if we don't meet quality standards and how the activities are carried out. So dispensations, invariably involve some kind of concession to quality standards. And or certainly the standards we've set, and whether they can be justified or not is probably a different question. But there's something there about how our regulatory systems are there to protect vulnerability. They are there to protect notions of public value. And in a way, you can step quite easily back from that. You can roll back the integrity of your regulatory systems, and, vulnerable elements, whether they're people or aspects of your society, don't complain because of the fact that they are vulnerable. But that doesn't mean that they're not being terribly and disproportionately adversely affected by the circumstances we're facing. So one of the things I worry about is that in making concessions, we also back off accountability in our regulatory systems. And I actually think in these times of societal crisis, when our normative order is kind of thrown up in the air, regulators have actually got a really important job to keep people understanding about the direction we're headed. And even though we may be dealing with a crisis, we still have expected standards of behaviour that have to be met, and we still have expected standards of conduct and the quality of our work that has to be met.
Yes.
And people need to remain accountable for that. And ironically, when you've got a crisis, vulnerability manifests much more readily. And I worry that through the crisis, what we've really had is our most vulnerable part of our society has borne the brunt of the costs of it, and those that are less vulnerable have emerged relatively unscathed from it. And that maybe is a commentary on how well our regulatory systems have been able to continue to perform their essential function, which is to protect vulnerability and hold to account those that might take advantage of other people's vulnerabilities. So I think that would be something that I worry about from a regulatory stewardship perspective.
Thank you, George. And I guess the question there, members of the audience, is that a worry that you share? We only have a handful of minutes to go, so it may well be something that you can discuss afterwards. One of the things about these conversations, webinars, is they're designed to be ingested in all sorts of ways. I say hello to our friends at the Environmental Protection Authority, because I know that Dan and co are watching us, I suspect, and good morning to you. You'll be watching communally. Others will be watching individually. Others will be watching recordedly and or live. And there are all sorts of ways that these webinars are designed to be embedded, in the sense that they're deliberately there to be provocative, in the sense of questions that you're probably already having, conversations that you're already having, items that you're already discussing, what's happening where it is you are. Because once you change the names and the circumstances, we are, I think, in many ways, all in this together. Richrd, I turn last to you. What's your worry? Are you a worried man?
I'm always a bit worried, Ian. We deal with risk, and we need to manage risk, and that risk is at the border. So I'm always worried about the next thing. I'm like George. I think I think there will be another crisis at some point. And are we well prepared for that is what worries me. And just to pick up Karel's point, the well-being of your organisation and the people who work within it is absolutely fundamental to how you can respond, and how you maintain that is critical. And I worry about that as well. But that's why I'm here. I'm paid to worry about these things. So and provide my input into how we can help alleviate them, no doubt.
Thank you, Richrd, and thank you, George, and thank you, Karel. We're glad that we've got you to look after us, and we end it there. Thank you again to our excellent panelists, and members of the audience. Thank you to you. I've noticed that you're keeping an eye. You've come in at all the good times with questions, and I think we very much moved the story along. That's going to be it. Now we'll be back at the last Friday of July, which will be the 29th, talking in terms of design and dialogue, policy regulatory dialogue. Without giving the game away, we've got at least one chief executive who will have a particular level of experience in both of those sides of the bridge, and other leading experts in the field as well. It's been a pleasure to be with you. I close, as I always do, with the MB Karakia, and I do so now. Kia hike, te tapu, kia watia, te ara, kia tarukiai, te o marama, huie, takie. Members of the audience at this long Atariki weekend, stay safe, stay well, and until next time, from all of us on the GREG team and all our virtual studio guests, ka kite anō, and thank you very much.